The Galactic Coalition had long monitored humanity from a distance, observing their rapid expansion into the stars with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Unlike many other species, humans adapted quickly to new environments, their tenacity unmatched by most sentient life in the galaxy. The Coalition, an alliance of powerful civilizations, had been hesitant to involve Earth in military matters, dismissing them as a relatively young species with an aggressive but inefficient approach to warfare. That assumption changed the day the warlords attacked New Dresden. New Dresden was a human colony on the outskirts of the Orion Arm, a relatively new settlement that had thrived despite its isolated position. The settlers, mostly civilians, were supported by a modest planetary garrison, no more than a few thousand standard soldiers, an insignificant force by galactic standards. The warlords, a coalition of mercenary factions known for their brutality, saw an opportunity. Their fleets descended upon the colony like vultures, bombarding key structures and deploying ground troops to seize the settlement. They expected an easy victory. The Galactic Coalition, bound by its principles of neutrality in regional conflicts, did not intervene directly. Instead, a small observation fleet stationed in a nearby system was tasked with monitoring the event. Their orders were simple: evaluate the human response. A diplomatic envoy had already warned Earth of the impending attack, and now the Coalition's analysts watched, expecting a negotiation, perhaps a desperate surrender. What they saw instead sent a ripple of unease through the fleet. The human military response was swift. Before the warlords could fully establish control, Earth's forces arrived. Not their famed special forces, not an elite strike team, just a standard infantry division. The Coalition officers watching the unfolding battle exchanged skeptical glances. Regular human troops against the warlords? The outcome seemed obvious. The mercenaries had conquered entire planets with well-trained armies, and here they faced only Earth's so-called conventional soldiers. The battle began with the warlords' forces tightening their grip around New Dresden's central city. Their gunships patrolled the skies, their infantry moving through the streets with the confidence of seasoned killers. Human civilians were rounded up, forced into containment zones, while the warlords secured landing zones for reinforcements. They had done this 100 times before. There was no reason to expect anything different this time. Then the first human squads deployed. Coalition sensors detected the drop pods before the warlords did. Atmospheric entry was executed with pinpoint precision, the pods slamming into the ground just outside the occupied city, releasing soldiers with rapid efficiency. The warlords, still confident in their numerical superiority, moved to intercept. That was their first mistake. The Coalition officers leaned forward in their seats, their screens filled with chaotic battle footage. The human soldiers moved unlike any infantry force they had ever seen. They fought without hesitation, each action coordinated with ruthless efficiency. The warlords' forces were well armed, but their tactics relied on overwhelming force and fear. The humans, however, seemed immune to both. The first wave of warlord enforcers opened fire, expecting the usual exchange of gunfire that dictated most battles. Instead, the humans advanced with terrifying precision, using cover with instinctual effectiveness, returning fire in controlled bursts that cut down their enemies before they could react. The mercenaries, accustomed to crushing weak planetary defenses, had never encountered infantry that fought like this. The humans didn't panic, didn't retreat under fire. They adapted instantly, adjusting formations mid-battle, communicating with short, decisive commands. One warlord captain, watching the battle from his command tent, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had fought countless planetary militias, corporate security forces, and even some coalition peacekeepers. None of them had fought like this. His troops, who outnumbered the humans 3-1, were being forced back, their casualties mounting at an alarming rate. The humans fought as if they had nothing to lose, pressing forward even as explosions tore through their ranks. But it wasn't reckless. Every maneuver was deliberate, Every action had purpose. A coalition analyst, monitoring the battle from orbit, muttered a quiet observation. They don't just fight to win, they fight to break their enemy. The warlord captain soon realized the truth in that statement. His troops were faltering. The humans pushed through defensive lines with brutal efficiency, exploiting weaknesses with almost mechanical precision. The mercenaries who had once marched through the city with arrogance now scrambled for cover, their morale breaking. And then the real horror began. The humans stopped pushing forward. Instead, they started hunting. Coalition observers watched in stunned silence as the warlords, who had relied on ambush tactics and intimidation in countless battles, became the ones trapped. Human squads moved through the city like ghosts, striking and vanishing before the enemy could respond. They exploited every alley, every ruined building, every corridor. Mercenaries who had been so eager to conquer New Dresden now found themselves in a city that had turned against them. A squad of warlords attempted to regroup in an abandoned skyscraper, hoping to use the vantage point for a counterattack. The moment they reached the upper floors, the building collapsed in a series of controlled detonations. The humans had set the charges before the warlords even realized they were being led into a trap. Another group of mercenaries tried to escape through an underground transit system. Coalition drones caught the moment they realized their mistake. Silent figures in the darkness, waiting for them. The mercenaries never made it out. The battle lasted 6 hours. By the end of it, the warlords were in full retreat, abandoning weapons, vehicles, and even their wounded. The coalition fleet recorded everything. They had expected to see human resilience. They had expected stubborn resistance. They had not expected an execution. The warlord fleet, now in disarray, attempted to flee orbit, but Earth's naval forces had already arrived. There was no negotiation, no warning. The warlord ships were annihilated before they could activate their jump drives. In the aftermath, the coalition officers gathered for an emergency debriefing. Silence hung over the room as they reviewed the battle footage. "That wasn't an elite unit," one of them finally said. "That was just a standard deployment." The room remained quiet. Everyone understood what the unspoken question was. If this was how humans fought with their regular forces, what were their special forces like? The warlord captain staggered through the remains of what had once been his forward command post. His breaths ragged, his vision blurred by the acrid smoke still rising from the wreckage. His forces had been shattered. The mercenaries he had once commanded with absolute authority were now either dead, captured, or fleeing in blind terror. The humans had not just defeated his army, they had dismantled it, piece by piece, with a ruthless efficiency that defied everything he understood about warfare. He had fought against many species before, some strong, some weak, but none had ever fought like this. None had displayed such an uncanny ability to adapt, to exploit weaknesses so quickly and without hesitation. He had always believed that wars were won by numbers, by superior firepower and sheer aggression. The humans had proven him wrong in the most brutal way possible. The air was thick with the stench of burning machinery and charred flesh. The once proud banners of his warband now lay trampled in the mud, their insignias unrecognizable beneath layers of ash and blood. He stumbled toward a fallen communications array, his trembling fingers struggling to activate it. He had to send a distress signal, had to warn the others. Before he could react, a shadow moved in the periphery of his vision. A sharp, precise impact struck the side of his helmet, sending him sprawling onto the ground. Pain exploded through his skull as his vision spun, and when he finally managed to focus, he saw the silhouette of a human soldier standing over him. The soldier did not speak. His weapon remained steady, aimed directly at the captain's forehead. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt in his eyes. The warlord captain had seen many kinds of warriors in his lifetime, some filled with rage, others with arrogance, and some, very rarely, with fear. This human was different. He fought not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but with a cold, calculating precision that sent a chill through the warlord's very core. Before the captain could utter a word, a transmission crackled in through the soldier's earpiece. A female voice, calm and controlled, spoke in a language the captain barely understood. The soldier listened for a brief moment before lowering his weapon. He reached for a device on his wrist, and before the captain could react, a sharp pain lanced through his body. A tranquilizer. Darkness consumed him before he hit the ground. It seemed that way to him as well. The darkness consumed him before he hit the ground. When the warlord captain regained consciousness, he was no longer on the battlefield. His body ached, but he was alive. His armor had been stripped away, leaving him in a reinforced containment cell. The cold, sterile walls of what he assumed was a human military outpost surrounded him. A single light source cast long, eerie shadows across the floor, and the only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system. He sat up slowly, his mind still reeling from the events that had transpired. The door to his cell slid open with a quiet hiss, and a human officer stepped inside. Unlike the soldiers he had faced on the battlefield, this one wore no heavy armor, no combat gear. His uniform was crisp, unadorned except for a few insignias the warlord did not recognize. The officer studied him with an expression that was unreadable, his gaze piercing yet devoid of any discernible emotion. "You look surprised to be alive," the officer said, his voice steady and unhurried. The warlord captain gritted his teeth, his pride demanding he remain defiant despite his situation. "If you're expecting me to beg for my life, human, you'll be disappointed." The officer's lips twitched slightly, almost as if he found the statement amusing. "We don't expect anything from you. You're not important enough for that." The warlord bristled at the remark, but before he could respond, the officer continued. "We intercepted your transmissions before the battle ended. Your forces were in full retreat long before you even realized it. What remains of your fleet is either destroyed or in hiding, and your mercenaries have abandoned you. No one is coming to rescue you." The weight of the words settled heavily on the warlord's chest. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by a human only deepened the humiliation. Still, he refused to show weakness. "Then finish it," he snarled. "Kill me and be done with it." The officer tilted his head slightly, as if considering the request. "Why would we do that?" The warlord blinked, confused. "Because that's what you do to prisoners of war. That's what I would do." "Yes," the officer said, his tone devoid of judgment. "That is what you would do. But we aren't like you, and that is precisely why you lost." The warlord captain had no response. A silence stretched between them before the officer finally exhaled. "You were expecting special forces, weren't you?" The warlord's expression darkened, but he said nothing. The officer let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "You don't understand, do you? That was just our standard infantry, the ones we send when the situation is manageable." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Special forces are for when we don't want survivors." The warlord felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones. The officer turned and walked toward the exit, pausing only briefly before stepping through the threshold. "We'll let you think about that." The door hissed shut, leaving the warlord alone in the silence. For the first time in his life, he truly felt fear. The warlord captain sat in his cell, staring at the cold metal walls that surrounded him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. He had fought many battles, faced enemies who claimed to be the best warriors their species had to offer, but he had never encountered anything like the human soldiers who had obliterated his forces on New Dresden. And the most terrifying part? Those weren't even their best. His body still ached from the tranquilizer, but the pain was secondary to the overwhelming realization settling in his mind. If those were standard human troops, what could their special forces possibly be like? He didn't want to imagine it. Yet his thoughts refused to obey. He replayed the battle over and over in his head, trying to find a moment, any moment, where his forces could have turned the tide. But there was none. The humans had fought with a precision that bordered on the unnatural. They had anticipated every counterattack, adapted to every defensive measure as if they had seen it all before. There was no hesitation, no mercy. It was war stripped down to its purest, most terrifying form. The door to his cell opened again, and the same human officer stepped inside, his expression as unreadable as before. The warlord straightened, determined not to show weakness, though he knew the human could see through the act. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" the officer asked. The warlord said nothing. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction of confirming it. The officer sighed, stepping further into the room. "You want an answer. I can see it in your eyes." The warlord clenched his jaw. He hated that the human was right. The officer continued, his tone calm but edged with something darker. "You want to understand what makes our special forces different. You're looking for some kind of logic to it, something that fits into the way you understand war, but that's the problem, isn't it? Your kind fights wars like a game of territory and power. You assume strength is about the number of bodies you throw at a problem. You think discipline is just following orders, but you don't understand what it means to be human." The warlord narrowed his eyes. "Enlighten me, then." The officer gave a small, humorless smile. "All right." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You saw what our regular troops could do. They are trained to fight, to adapt, to think on their feet. But special forces?" He tilted his head slightly. "They aren't just trained. They are shaped, forged in conditions that would kill most other species. We break them down to nothing and rebuild them into something else, in something that can operate in complete isolation, cut off from all support, behind enemy lines, in environments so hostile that no sane soldier would ever dare enter. And they don't just survive. They complete the mission." The warlord scoffed, forcing out a weak smirk. "Every species has elite warriors. You act like yours are special." The officer's expression didn't change. "No, I act like yours are predictable." The warlord's smirk faded. The officer continued. "Your mercenaries fight for pay. Your warlords fight for power. Even your best warriors fight for honor, for legacy, for recognition. But our special forces fight for something you don't understand. They fight because they have become something else, something that doesn't stop, something that doesn't break. They are given the most impossible tasks, sent into places where no one else can go, and they don't just complete the mission." He paused, his gaze darkening. "They make sure no one else ever dares to try again." The warlord felt his stomach tighten, but he refused to show it. The officer studied him for a moment before stepping back. "Let me tell you a story." He clasped his hands behind his back and began pacing slowly. "Years ago, there was an insurgency on a frozen world in the outer colonies. A warlord, not unlike yourself, had fortified himself deep in the ice, using the terrain to his advantage. The coalition deemed it an unwinnable conflict, too many casualties, too much risk. Then, Earth sent a special forces team. The warlord captain listened despite himself. The officer's voice remained steady. A team of 6, that's all, just 6 soldiers. They infiltrated the warlord's stronghold, sabotaged his supply chains, and dismantled his network without being detected. Over the course of 3 weeks, his forces started vanishing. Patrols never returned. Officers were found dead in their own secured bunkers. Then, the warlord himself disappeared. His own men found him days later, frozen in the snow, his throat slit so cleanly it took them a moment to realize he was dead. The officer stopped pacing and looked directly at the warlord. 6 soldiers ended a war. And no one even saw them do it. The warlord felt something cold settle in his chest. He had thought himself untouchable. He had built his empire on strength, on fear, on the understanding that no one could reach him if he held enough power. But if even a fortified warlord with an entire army had been helpless against just 6 humans, what chance had he ever really had? The officer took a step closer. That's the difference. That's what you don't understand. Regular soldiers win battles. Special forces end wars before they even begin. The warlord didn't respond. The officer held his gaze for a long moment before turning toward the door. Just as it slid open, he spoke one last time. "You were lucky, you know. You got to see what our standard forces can do. You'll never see the others coming." The door hissed shut behind him, leaving the warlord alone with the silence. For the first time in his life, he wished he had never gone to war with humanity. The warlord captain sat motionless on the narrow bench in his cell, his mind consumed by a suffocating silence. He had always thought he understood war, its brutality, its calculations, its costs. He had believed himself to be a master of battle, a leader forged through conquest, someone who could read the flow of combat and dictate its outcome. But he had been wrong. The words of the human officer haunted him. 6 soldiers ended a war. He had scoffed at first, dismissing it as an exaggeration, but the tone in the officer's voice had been too steady, too absolute. Humans did not bluff, not the way his kind did. He had fought human infantry, seen their tactics firsthand. If those were just their standard soldiers, if those relentless coordinated killers were merely the foundation, then what existed beyond that? His imagination had begun to construct terrifying images of what the special forces might be. Soldiers that couldn't be tracked, assassins that left no trace, hunters that wore the shadows like armor. It was irrational, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already lost, long before the battle for New Dresden had even begun. The cell door slid open. A different human entered this time. He was taller than the first officer, his movements slow, deliberate. His uniform bore no insignias, no identifying marks of rank or allegiance. His presence felt heavier, as if the air itself recognized him as something dangerous. The warlord straightened instinctively, a survival response ingrained in him through years of battle. He did not recognize this human, but something told him that this was no ordinary officer. The human pulled out a chair, turned it around, and sat down in front of the warlord with an unsettling calm. His eyes, cold and calculating, studied him as though he were a specimen in a lab. "You've been briefed," the man finally said. His voice was deeper, quieter than the other officers, but every word carried weight. "You understand now that your forces never stood a chance. But you're still missing something. That's why I'm here." The warlord met his gaze, refusing to look away. "And what exactly am I missing?" The human leaned forward slightly. "The part where you realize that humanity doesn't just fight wars. We end them, before our enemies even know they've started." A chill ran through the warlord's spine, but he didn't let it show. "You talk a lot about ending wars, yet here I am, still alive. You had every opportunity to kill me on the battlefield. So why am I here?" The human smirked, though there was no warmth in it. "Because you're useful. Your warband wasn't the only one eyeing human territory. There are others, and they will see your defeat as a sign of weakness. We need them to know exactly what happens when you challenge us." The warlord narrowed his eyes. "So I'm a message." The human gave a slow nod. "Exactly, but not in the way you think." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small data pad, activating it with a quick tap. A series of images flickered onto the screen, footage of human soldiers moving through the ruins of the battlefield, inspecting captured warlord technology, analyzing enemy tactics. Then the feed shifted, and the warlord's breath caught in his throat. The image showed one of his secondary outposts, a hidden supply base buried deep within an asteroid field, a location known only to his inner circle. Or at least, that was what he had believed. The footage showed a figure moving through the compound undetected, disabling security measures with precise, practiced motions. The warlord recognized the insignia on the uniforms of his guards. Personal enforcers, his most trusted warriors. He watched as the figure moved between them like a shadow, leaving no sound, no sign of struggle. One by one, his men vanished, their bodies dragged into the darkness before alarms could sound. The footage ended. The warlord stared at the blank screen, his mind racing. "When was this recorded?" 2 days ago, the human said. "One of our operatives infiltrated your base before your fleet even reached New Dresden." The warlord clenched his fists. "Impossible. That station is Was, the human corrected, was a hidden asset. Now it belongs to us. The warlord's blood ran cold. He had underestimated human soldiers, that much he had already accepted. But this was something else. "You're lying," he said, though the words felt hollow. The human slid the data pad across the table. "Go ahead. Check the transmission logs. Verify the footage yourself. You'll see that it's real." The warlord didn't move. He already knew the truth. The human sat back, crossing his arms. "You see, we didn't just win on the battlefield. We dismantled you before you even knew you were at war. We infiltrated your ranks, studied your strategies, anticipated your moves. We left nothing to chance. And we did it without ever deploying special forces." The warlord exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like a collapsing star. If this was what humans could do without their elite warriors, then what horrors did their special forces unleash? The human leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're beginning to understand now, aren't you? The reason we don't use them often, the reason we don't need to. Our standard forces are terrifying enough. Our special forces? They are the reason no one dares challenge Earth twice." The warlord said nothing. He had nothing left to say. The human stood, gathering the data pad as he prepared to leave. "Your warband is gone. Your fleet is destroyed. You have no empire left to return to. But we're not going to kill you. We want you to go back and tell them what you've seen. We want you to warn them." The warlord swallowed hard. He understood now. He wasn't just a prisoner. He wasn't a message. He was a warning. The warlord captain sat alone in his cell, the weight of his own existence pressing down on him with an intensity he had never felt before. He had always lived as a conqueror, believing himself to be a force of nature, someone who shaped war rather than someone shaped by it. But now, sitting in silence, stripped of his power, his army, and his empire, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his bones. Fear. The door slid open again, but he didn't look up. He already knew who had entered. The same human who had shown him the footage of his fallen outpost. The one who had spoken of unseen battles and wars that ended before they began. The warlord had spent his life believing in power as something tangible. Ships, weapons, soldiers. But humans had rewritten those rules. He no longer understood war the way he thought he did. The human stepped closer, his presence unnervingly calm. "You understand now, don't you?" His voice was quiet, but there was something sharp beneath it. "You've realized that you were never in control." The warlord forced himself to look up, his pride still clinging to the last remnants of defiance. "If you're so powerful, why am I still alive?" His voice was hoarse but steady. "Why not just erase me like you did everything else?" The human studied him for a moment before pulling out a small device and placing it on the table between them. A holographic interface flickered to life, displaying a series of star maps. The warlord recognized them immediately. Former strongholds of his allies, safe havens where those who had fought alongside him might have fled. The human tapped one of the glowing points. "You asked why you're still alive? It's because of this. We don't want to kill you. We want you to deliver a message." The warlord felt his stomach tighten. A warning. The human nodded. "That's right. You will go to them, and you will tell them what you've seen. You will tell them that humanity does not fight wars in the way your kind does. We don't engage in endless battles, grinding down enemies over years or decades. We don't fight wars that we don't intend to finish. You underestimated us once. That was a mistake." The warlord clenched his jaw, refusing to give the human the satisfaction of seeing his fear. "And if I refuse?" The human smirked, though there was no humor in it. "You won't." He reached forward and tapped the hologram again. The image shifted to display security footage from within the warlord's most secret council chamber. His heart stopped. He saw his own advisors speaking in hushed tones, their faces twisted in fear, their words confirming what he had begun to suspect. They had abandoned him long before the battle had even started. They had already sought new alliances, already begun carving up the remains of his empire among themselves. The human leaned in slightly. You have no warband left, no fleet, no empire. If you refuse to be our messenger, then you're just a man sitting in a cell, waiting for his enemies to finish what we didn't. The warlord swallowed hard. The humans had not just defeated him, they had taken everything from him. His army, his power, his very identity. But what unsettled him most was the realization that this was all intentional. They hadn't broken him by accident. They had planned this from the very beginning. The human stood and deactivated the hologram, slipping the device back into his uniform. You will be released. Your ship will be prepared with enough supplies to reach one of these systems. He gestured toward the fading holographic map. You will tell them what happened here, and then you will watch as fear does the rest of the work for us. The warlord inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had once believed that fear was a weapon he wielded over others. Now he understood that he had never known real fear. Not until now. The human walked to the door but paused before stepping through. One more thing, he said without turning around. If you ever think about coming back, about testing humanity again, just remember one thing. He finally looked over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. You still haven't seen our special forces. The door slid shut, leaving the warlord alone once more. He sat there for a long time, staring at the cold metal walls, listening to the hum of the ventilation system. He thought about the soldiers who had torn through his army as if they were nothing. He thought about the unseen operative who had walked through his outpost like a ghost. He thought about the warlord on the frozen world, the one who had vanished into the snow, killed by a force no one had even seen coming. And then, for the first time in his life, he prayed that he never did.